The millionaire was at work preparing for a meeting when he was abruptly called by his daughter. When he accepted the call, it began with ragged breathing, followed by his daughter's terrified cry, "The neighbor is trying to break in." The millionaire was stunned and immediately rushed home. Arthur Sterling stood close to the edge of the reinforced glass window on the 50th floor. Below Manhattan unfolded like a colossal electronic chessboard with lines of vehicles stretching into red and white light trails. At this elevation, the blare of car horns, the sounds of disputes, or the city's frantic pace could not reach him. Arthur cherished this quietude. To him, silence was the sound of authority. He had spent his entire life procuring this stillness, isolating himself from the common tumult of the world beneath. He turned his gaze, sweeping across the vast expanse of his polished mahogany desk. Not a single paper out of place, not a speck of dust. Everything resided in its correct location, much like his life. In the corner of the desk, a gleaming silver photo frame stood prominently. It was the sole family picture in the office. In the photograph, Arthur wore a dark suit, standing rigidly with the confidence of a man holding the financial lifeblood of half the city. Beside him was Isabella, his second wife, 10 years his junior. She was striking a sharp and cool beauty as if sculpted from marble. Her hand rested gently on the shoulder of his young daughter, Lily. Arthur looked at his daughter. 7-year-old Lily, in a dark blue velvet dress, stood as solemnly as a small soldier. She wasn't smiling. Her large, round eyes stared straight into the lens, but lacked the usual playfulness of a child. Arthur nodded, slightly satisfied with the image. He didn't perceive sadness in those eyes. He only saw the outcome of impeccable nurturing. Children require structure more than giggles, Isabella had told him on the day the photograph was taken. Arthur believed her. He recalled how Isabella had persuaded him to let go of the longtime nanny 2 years prior. "A stranger cannot mentor our child to become a sterling Arthur," she had said, her voice soft yet firm as she poured his tea. "Only a mother knows how to shape the young saplings. Lily is too timid. She needs fortitude to grow resilient." Arthur had consented. He believed Isabella was sacrificing personal freedom to cultivate Lily's future. Since then, whenever he drove to his Connecticut estate on weekends, he was greeted by absolute order. No boisterous shouts, no garish plastic playthings strewn across the expensive flooring. The residence was consistently tranquil, spotless, and fragrant with lilies. To Arthur, that tranquility symbolized security. He believed he had constructed an impenetrable sanctuary for his daughter, where life's hazards were barred beyond the iron gate. He glanced at the timepiece on his wrist. 6 in the evening. His schedule for the day was finished, but he felt a sense of relief remembering he didn't need to return home tonight. He had a crucial conference in the morning and would lodge in his city penthouse apartment. Honestly, Arthur cherished his family, but he cherished them in the manner of an investor. He cherished their perfection from a distance. His choice to stay here to acquire a few more $1 million nightly was how he expressed that affection. He believed the expression of devotion wasn't mushy embraces, but rather the figures in the trust fund guaranteeing Lily would never have to bow to anyone. He reached for the file for tomorrow's conference, savoring the sensation of complete oversight over his destiny. The sound of the telephone violently split the silence, sharp and insistent, like a fire alarm. Arthur started, his hand freezing mid-air. It was not the office phone. It was the black device deep in the drawer, the private line whose number he had given to only 2 individuals, his wife and his daughter. It had never rung at this hour. Arthur fixated on the name displayed on the screen, Lily. A furrow appeared on his brow. The child never initiated contact with him. At home, the regulation was distinct: do not disturb Dad when he is occupied, unless it is Isabella calling to provide a status update on her studies. Arthur hesitated for a second, then answered the call, his thumb sliding firmly across the touchscreen. Annoyance crept into his tone, already preparing a gentle reminder about discipline. "Lily, you know I'm busy right now," he stated, his eyes still fixed on the file. But there was no immediate reply, only the sound of breathing, short, rapid, and gasping breaths like someone fleeing. It echoed in Arthur's ear, sharp and real, to the extent that he felt the exhalation on the back of his neck. He ceased turning the pages. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. "Lily," he inquired again, his voice lower this time. "Where is your mother?" "Daddy." Lily's voice came through, fragile like fracturing glass. It wasn't the voice of the well-behaved child Arthur heard every weekend. It trembled, fractured, and was consumed by terror. "The neighbor! The neighbor is trying to force entry!" The statement descended into the office's quiet space like a shock wave. Arthur leaped up. The leather chair behind him scraped forcefully, hitting the wall with a loud sound. All the composure, all the strategic maneuvering he prided himself on immediately dissipated. In his mind, a terrifying scenario began to play out rapidly. He didn't require further details. His brain, a mechanism programmed to evaluate risk, instantly filled in the blanks with his worst fear. The neighbor. Elias's image immediately appeared. The man who resided alone in a dilapidated wooden house, separated from his estate by only a flimsy fence. Arthur remembered the man's sullen expression, his grease-stained attire, and unrefined look. He had always warned Isabella that the man was a peril, a struggling individual coveting their wealth. And now, as the turmoil approached, as night descended, he was acting. "Lily, listen to me!" Arthur yelled, gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Secure your room door. Where is your mother? Tell her to contact law enforcement at once." "Mommy isn't here." Lily choked out her sobs, sounding like a small cornered creature. "I'm frightened." The door's vibrating. He's striking the door. The sound of metal impacting wood transmitted through the phone's speaker, harsh and brutal. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was the sound of a forceful entry, the sound of aggression. Each sound resonated like a hammer blow directly to Arthur's chest. The Connecticut estate, the sanctuary he believed to be completely secure, was under assault. And inside that sanctuary, there was only a solitary 7-year-old child. "I'm coming home now. I'm on my way," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Do not hang up, Lily. I will." The connection was lost. A chilling silence enveloped the other end of the line. Arthur stared at the dark phone screen, a tide of helplessness washing over him, swallowing him whole. The phone slipped from his hand, falling onto the wooden desktop with a dry thud. He bolted from his desk, his steps staggering, colliding painfully with the desk edge, but he felt nothing. He shoved the office door open, dashing into the corridor. Several subordinate staff members were gathered at the reception desk, holding files awaiting signatures. They looked up, their customary smiles dissolving upon seeing their boss's expression. Arthur's face was flushed crimson, his eyes streaked with red, his tie skewed. "Mr. Sterling." The conference with the assistant began tentatively. "Get out of my way," Arthur roared without slowing down. He sped past them like a hurricane, leaving astonished and terrified looks in his wake. He slammed the elevator call button repeatedly, as if the force of his fist could make it arrive faster. Every passing second was agonizing. He envisioned Elias smashing through the door, entering the house with his soiled footwear scarring the white marble floor. He imagined Lily huddled in the corner of a room. Ding. The elevator door opened. Arthur plunged inside, hitting the button for the parking basement. As the metal door closed, he saw his reflection on the elevator wall. A stranger, wild and consumed by a ferocious intent. The elevator descended so quickly that his ears popped. Floor 40, floor 30, floor 20. He took out his phone, attempting to reach Lily again. "The party you were trying to reach is currently unavailable." He called Isabella, voicemail. "Darn it, where in the world are you?" Arthur cursed, striking the elevator wall. Why wasn't his wife at home at this hour? Why would she leave their daughter alone? But his anger directed at Isabella was rapidly eclipsed by his fury toward the intruder. The parking garage appeared expansive and desolate, reeking of gasoline and damp concrete. Arthur sprinted toward his glossy black sports vehicle. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the garage like shots fired. His hand trembled as he inserted the key into the ignition. It took him 3 attempts to hit the mark. He got into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, cutting himself off from the outside world. But this separation offered no sense of security, unlike his office. It offered the feeling of a metal cage hurtling into battle. Arthur turned the key. The V8 engine roared an angry and potent sound, shattering the quietude of the garage. He aggressively pressed the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires screeching on the slick concrete. As the car shot up the ramp to exit the garage, a blinding flash of lightning tore across the dark Manhattan sky. A rumble of thunder followed, immediately shaking the ground. The wipers on the sports car vigorously swept side to side, but they seemed helpless against the dense sheet of water pouring from the black sky. Arthur Sterling gritted his teeth, pressing the accelerator even harder. The speedometer needle had passed the authorized limit on the highway, but he didn't care. Other vehicles veered aside, making way for the metallic beast charging ahead in a rage. Inside the cabin, the sound of the rain impacting the roof sounded like pebbles thrown onto a tin roof, rapid and chaotic. Arthur pressed the redial button for Isabella for the 5th time. "Please, Isabella, pick up the phone," he murmured, his finger tapping an anxious rhythm on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. "Hello, you've reached Isabella. I'm currently unable to take your call. Please leave a message." His wife's sweet, composed voice, emanating from the car speaker, sharply contrasted with the current situation. Arthur terminated the call, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Her silence was more terrifying than any scream. It could only signify one thing: she could not answer the phone. She was being held against her will. In Arthur's mind, all the isolated pieces began to self-organize into a bleak picture, and the heart of that picture was Elias. Elias. The name resonated in his head, full of bitterness. Arthur had never taken a liking to that neighbor. He lived in a worn-down wooden house with a rusted tin roof tucked right next to Arthur's flawlessly manicured grounds. It was an aesthetic offense. Arthur recalled the last time he encountered the man. It was a Sunday afternoon as Arthur was driving toward the gate. Elias was meticulously tinkering with his battered pickup truck. He looked up, wiping his oil-smeared hands on his dirty coveralls, then looked at Arthur. That look. Arthur had once presumed it was the envy of the impoverished looking up at the wealthy, but now he realized how naive he had been. It was the look of a predator assessing the distance to the sheep pen. I should have erected a higher perimeter. Arthur chastised himself, hitting the steering wheel. I should have had him relocated last year. Memories surged back, distorted and sharp. He recalled afternoons when he worked in his study and looked out the window, seeing Elias standing by the decaying wooden fence. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there smoking and staring at the window of Lily's room on the 2nd floor. At the time, Arthur only felt irritation. He assumed the man was merely curious, a solitary man with nothing better to do. But now, under the gloomy light of the storm's headlights, that memory carried a completely different nuance. He wasn't curious. He was observing. He was memorizing his family's daily routine. He was anticipating this moment, the moment the master was absent and only vulnerable women remained. "A predator," Arthur hissed through clenched teeth. "You planned this whole thing." Isabella's image appeared in his mind, delicate as an orchid. His wife was too gentle. She never raised her voice at anyone. Her hands were only accustomed to holding teacups and arranging flowers. How could she possibly defend herself against a rough manual laborer like Elias and Lily? The child didn't even dare to look a stranger in the eye. Arthur felt nausea rise in his throat. It was the pang of guilt. He had been overly confident in the security of this neighborhood. He hadn't employed personal security personnel because Isabella desired privacy. He had left them alone next to a ticking explosive device. "I am sorry," he said to the empty space in the car, hot tears threatening to spill, but swallowed back by the surging rage. "I will correct this mistake. I promise." The rain grew heavier. Visibility ahead was only a chaotic gray mass. Any rational driver would decelerate or pull over, but Arthur pressed the accelerator harder. He was no longer a business executive. He was adopting the role of the hero rescuing the damsel in distress, a narrative his own mind fabricated to calm the gnawing fear. He had to get home before it was too late. He had to make the individual who dared to intrude on his territory face the consequences. The car exited the highway, turning onto the paved road leading to the Connecticut suburb. The trees lining the road swayed in the windstorm like beckoning apparitions. Finally, the Sterling estate gate appeared through the white curtain of rain. The iron gate remained closed. Arthur didn't wait for it to open automatically. He drove around onto the lawn, the wheels crushing the expensive rose bushes Isabella tended to. The car skidded on the wet grass and gravel, creating a long, muddy streak before braking abruptly right in front of the main entrance. Screech. Splash. The car halted, the engine's heat rising in steam, blending with the cold rain. Arthur turned on the headlights to their brightest setting. The blinding white light tore through the night, illuminating the house's main entrance, and the scene before him caused the blood in his veins to freeze, then surge with heat. Just as he had feared, Elias was there. The neighbor stood right at the doorstep, completely drenched his clothing, clinging to his lean but sinewy frame. In his hands was neither a bouquet of flowers nor a greeting. Elias was holding a large black iron bar high above his head with both hands. He adopted a stance, focusing all his body's force into his arms, preparing to deliver a powerful blow to the intricately carved oak door, the final barrier shielding Arthur's daughter. "Stop!" Arthur screamed from the car, knowing the man couldn't hear him. He flung the car door open, rushing out into the storm without any defensive implements, without any planning. Would blinding rage lead to an irreversible misstep? How would Arthur act when confronted with the villain right before his eyes? Tap follow and share your predictions below so you don't miss the intense confrontation. In the next part, "Hey Elias, halt right there, are you hard of hearing?" Arthur bellowed, his voice tearing through the dense downpour. The rain lashed his face painfully, but the fierce anger heated his entire body. His custom-tailored Italian suit now clung to his skin, heavy as waterlogged armor. Yet Arthur rushed forward without hesitation. His steps pounded on the stone pathway, each one a declaration of war. At the entrance, under the faint yellow light projected by the motion sensor, Elias still stood. His back was to Arthur, his lean shoulders hunched beneath his old soaking wet shirt. He didn't turn around. There was no reaction indicating he recognized the homeowner's presence. "I told you to drop that object." Arthur shouted again, the authoritative command of a CEO echoing across the front yard. "This is unauthorized home entry. I will ensure you spend a long time in detention." The only response to the firm threat was the sound of metal slicing through the air. Whoosh! Elias swung the iron bar high above his head. Under the erratic flash of lightning, the black iron object looked like a grim reaper's sickle. Crash! The iron bar slammed into the main door's lock. The jarring collision was deafening, overpowering the thunder overhead. Splinters of precious oak wood sprayed out like fragments of shattered bone. Arthur paused for a second in shock. That door was constructed from centuries-old oak, imported from France, intricately carved by master artisans. It wasn't just a door. It symbolized the Sterling family's affluent status and inviolability. And now this impoverished man was devastating it without remorse. "You scoundrel!" Arthur hissed, charging faster. As the distance narrowed, the headlights from the still-running car shone directly onto Elias's back. Arthur saw more clearly. The neighbor's sinewy hands were visibly trembling, not the tremor of aggression or frenzy. It was the trembling of absolute exhaustion. Sweat mixed with rainwater streamed down his gaunt, weathered face, dripping onto his worn, soaked khaki pants. He was gasping for breath, his chest intensely heaving like a forge bellows about to burst. His harsh, labored breathing echoed during the brief lulls in the rain. But Arthur did not register the weariness. In his eyes now was only the crimson hue of fury. Elias's actions were more than property destruction. It was an outrage, a direct challenge to the pride of the family patriarch. He was attempting to seize his daughter's security, seizing the impeccable order he had diligently built with money and influence. "What do you want?" Arthur growled, his hands clenched into rigid fists. "Money, possessions. You think you can just walk into my house that easily?" Smack, another powerful strike. This time the iron bar glanced off, carving a long, deep gouge in the polished varnish. Elias staggered, nearly collapsing, but he used the iron object to steady himself. Arthur noticed something peculiar. Elias wasn't striking the window glass. He also wasn't attempting to pry open the back door or enter via the garage. He was aggressively targeting the main lock, the area equipped with the most advanced fingerprint security system. This reinforced Arthur's assumption. This was a brazen attempted seizure. The man wanted immediate access to the house. He wanted to force the main door open to boldly enter like a conqueror trampling on the homeowner's dignity. "You targeted the wrong residence, you failure," Arthur muttered, adrenaline flooding his chest. He was only a few steps away from Elias. He was prepared. A punch to the ribs or a kick to the knee. He would take the man down, pinning him to the cold ground and making him accountable for every mark on that door. Where was Lily inside the house? Was she hiding under a table or huddled in a closet? The thought of his little princess, trembling in fear, further fueled the aggressive impulse in Arthur. He had to protect his child. It was instinct. It was a sacred duty. "Put the weapon down and get on the ground immediately," Arthur ordered one last time, his voice sharp, cold, and unrelenting. Elias seemed not to hear, or perhaps he lacked the remaining energy to care about anything other than the objective before him. He raised his head slightly, revealing his drawn, harsh face under the lights. His eyes were deeply set, shadowed, and conveyed a haunting despair. But Arthur could not interpret that look. He only saw stubbornness. Elias took a deep breath, the sound whistling through his teeth. He took one step back, gathering momentum. He didn't swing the iron bar again. He let it hang at his side, gripping it tightly under his armpit. He focused all his lean body weight, all the remaining energy in his exhausted muscles, into his right shoulder. "Don't do it!" Arthur screamed, charging forward to grasp the man's shoulder. But he was a beat too late. Elias threw his entire body against the thick wooden door. A reckless, almost suicidal action. Boom! A deafening sound like an explosion rang out, overwhelming the thunder and lightning above. The entire door frame vibrated violently. The metal hinges groaned, emitting a terrifying cracking sound of severance. The wood cracked open. Arthur froze his hand, still suspended in the air. The neighbor, the man he intended to reprimand, had now stumbled inside with the shattered door. Before the sound of splintering wood subsided, another sound echoed. Clang. The black iron bar slipped from Elias's hand, crashing onto the white marble floor, rolling a few times before settling motionlessly. The cold metallic sound was like an abrupt finale to the symphony of aggression and chaos that had just transpired. The thick oak door had been torn from its hinges, leaning haphazardly against the hallway wall like a defeated soldier. Wood fragments were scattered everywhere, mixing with the muddy puddles Elias had tracked in from outside. Arthur paused mid-lunge, his hands still clenched into fists, his muscles taut for a physical confrontation. He stood frozen at the threshold, his breathing rapid, blending with the frantic rhythm of the rain behind him. His eyes widened quickly, assessing Elias's form, awaiting another aggressive action. He expected the man to charge into the house, ransack belongings, or scream insane demands. But there was nothing. Elias did not rush in. He staggered back a step, leaning against the empty doorframe, his shoulders slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. His chest intensely heaved, attempting to draw in every gulp of the humid air. His thin arms hung limply by his sides, trembling and powerless. That appearance bore no resemblance to a conqueror intoxicated by victory. It was the appearance of someone who had just shed an immense burden, too exhausted to stand firm. And then the quietude descended. It wasn't the pleasant stillness Arthur typically bought with wealth. It was a deadly silence, thick and suffocating. Why wasn't Isabella shouting? Why wasn't Lily screaming after seeing the door broken? Why wasn't the expensive security system wailing loudly? Surely, with such force applied to the door, the entire neighborhood should be in an uproar from the alarm. But no. There was only the steady patter of rain outside the entrance and the whistling wind through the fractured opening. Arthur frowned, a cold shiver running down his spine, not from the storm's chill. From inside the pitch-dark house, a gust of wind swept out, hitting him directly in the face. Arthur instinctively took a deep breath, anticipating the familiar scent of lilies, the expensive scented candles, or the agreeable warmth from the fireplace Isabella always had, ready to welcome him home. But what assaulted his nose was a completely different scent. The smell of mildew. The smell of stagnant air that hadn't been circulated for an extended period. The chilling scent of an abandoned cellar, not of a family dwelling. The smell evoked ultimate solitude, causing Arthur's stomach to clench. "What in the world is going on?" Arthur whispered, his voice lost in the wind. The motion sensor light at the entrance suddenly brightened upon detecting movement shining directly onto Elias's face. For the first time that night, Arthur clearly saw his neighbor without the obstruction of the car window or the blurred rain. There was no greed, no maliciousness or triumph of a criminal. On Elias's gaunt, harsh face, only profound sadness was present. His deeply set, shadowed eyes looked at Arthur devoid of fear or evasion. That gaze contained sympathy, a raw and painful sympathy for Arthur himself. It was the gaze of a man who had witnessed too much distress, a man who had just fulfilled a painful task without anticipating any compensation. Elias slowly lifted his trembling right arm. He wasn't pointing at Arthur. He wasn't pointing at the iron bar on the ground. He pointed his calloused fingers stained with wood dust and dried blood into the pitch-black void inside the house. He did not utter a single word. It wasn't necessary. The gesture spoke louder than any accusation. It was like a cold invitation challenging Arthur to step into the darkness, to face the harsh reality he had been blindly disregarding all this time. "Go in," Elias said, his voice hoarse, fragmented like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. "Go on and observe." Arthur swallowed hard, his throat dry. The anger within him began to fade, replaced by a vague but piercing terror infiltrating every cell. He felt as though he were standing at the brink of an abyss, and the next step would decide whether he fell or awoke. He glanced at Elias once more, seeking a sign of deceit, but only found a brutal honesty in those weary eyes. Arthur inhaled, attempting to calm his frantically pounding heart. He raised his foot, stepping across the shattered threshold. His expensive leather shoes crunched on the wood fragments, the dry sound echoing in the silent hallway. His legs felt like lead. Each step was a struggle against the instinct to turn and flee. The darkness inside immediately engulfed him. Arthur squinted, trying to adjust to the sudden lack of light. The hallway lighting system did not automatically illuminate as usual. The entire house was submerged in thick darkness, with only faint street lamp light filtering through a distant living room window. And then he saw it. In the large living room's corner, where the velvet-covered sofas were draped in stark white plastic covers like specters, there was a small shape. The door was open, but why was the greeting a terrifying silence and darkness? Do you feel a wrenching in your heart at Lily's reaction? Leave a heart if you are holding your breath for the final revelation in the next development. He inhaled deeply, but the air here was thick with the scent of mildew, the smell of dust that hadn't been swept away in a long time, not the scent of lavender oil he often smelled when Isabella opened the door to greet him. He reached out, fumbling along the familiar wall, his fingers brushing the intelligent lighting control panel. He pressed the button. Once, twice, thrice. Nothing changed. The darkness remained pervasive, obstinate, and defiant. "It's no use," Elias said from behind, his voice hoarse. "The main circuit breaker is off. She wanted to ensure no light escaped." Arthur dropped his hand, a feeling of impotence seeping into his being. He pulled out his phone, activating the flashlight. The cold white beam swept across the room, exposing hidden areas the darkness had concealed. And what Arthur saw caused his stomach to clench. The costly Italian leather sofas where he once sat reading the paper and sipping wine were now completely covered in thick, stark white plastic sheeting like shrouds. They lay still cold like nameless graves. On the glass table, a thin layer of dust suggested that no one had touched or used this room for a very long time. Arthur approached, his finger trailing a long line through the dust. He looked down at his gray fingertip. "Tidy," he murmured, his voice caught. She always insisted the house had to be tidy. Now he understood what Isabella's tidiness implied. It wasn't the neatness of a disciplined family. It was prohibition. It was the suppression of all signs of life. No one was permitted to sit on the sofas. No one was permitted to stain the table. This house wasn't for living. It was a glass enclosure displaying Isabella's counterfeit perfection. He directed the flashlight toward the window. The thick velvet curtains were tightly drawn. He approached, pulling the curtain back forcefully. Behind the double-pane reinforced glass wooden planks were nailed diagonally, sealing off all escape routes, transforming the window frame into prison bars. "My God!" Arthur gasped, his hands trembling as he touched the rough wooden planks. Why would she do this? A small sound came from the corner of the room, pulling Arthur from his shock. A rustling sound, like a tiny animal scampering. He turned the flashlight toward the area. In the farthest corner of the living room, hidden behind the large grand piano, a small figure was huddled. Lily. Arthur called, his voice breaking, filled with remorse and anxiety. He quickly walked toward his daughter, the flashlight leading the way. Lily was sitting on the ice-cold marble floor, her two hands tightly embracing her thin knees. She was wearing a thin old nightgown, slightly too short for her growing height. Her bare feet were purple from the cold. Next to Lily was an empty, crumpled 500 milliliters water bottle. There were no food dishes, no playthings, no blankets or pillows, only the cold stone floor and the darkness. "Daddy is here, Lily." "I'm home," Arthur said, kneeling before his daughter, extending his arms to embrace the small child. But Lily did not rush into his arms. She recoiled, huddling even closer to the wall. Her large, round eyes were wide open, staring intently at Arthur. Not a look of joy, nor a look of appeal. It was a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," Lily whispered, her voice trembling so severely Arthur had to lean close to hear. "I didn't mean to be loud. I didn't mean to call. Please don't punish me. I promise to be good." Arthur was stunned. His arms hung suspended in the air, chillingly cold. "Punish you, no, Lily. No one is going to punish you," Arthur said urgently, trying to calm her. "I came home to rescue you. I came home to protect you." Lily violently shook her head, fresh tears starting to roll down her drawn cheeks. She stared at Arthur's soaking wet suit, at his angry face from moments earlier, and the fear in her eyes intensified. "Mommy told me not to bother you," Lily choked out. "She said you dislike noise. She said if I wasn't quiet, you wouldn't love me anymore." Each word from the child was like a razor-sharp cut to Arthur's heart. He felt his chest shattering. He had believed her silence was obedience. He had boasted proudly about her maturity. But it turned out that silence was constructed from the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being reprimanded by the very father she adored. Isabella had instilled in this innocent child the notion that her existence was a burden, that her voice was a transgression, and Arthur, through his detachment, had unwittingly enabled it. "I would never dislike you, Lily. Never." Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion, hot tears welling in his eyes. He tried to move closer, wanting to touch her shoulder to convey warmth, but Lily flinched, evading her father's hand. Her gaze darted past Arthur's shoulder toward the breached main entrance. She looked at Elias. The neighbor stood there, leaning against the doorframe, silent and patient. He did not approach, maintaining a respectful distance, but when Lily's gaze met his, Arthur saw her body relax slightly. The tension eased. Lily was not seeking safety from her wealthy biological father. She sought it from the impoverished man smeared with dirt whom she had never spoken to directly before. The man who had listened to her fingernails scratching the glass. The man who had forced the door open to provide air for her to breathe. This cruel truth completely shattered Arthur. He knelt onto the floor, his hands braced on the ground, his head bowed. He was undeserving of being a father. He was a monumental failure in $1 million suit. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Arthur mumbled, unsure if he was speaking to Lily, to Elias, or to his own conscience. A cold wind swept in through the main entrance, carrying rainwater that lashed Arthur's face, rousing him slightly. He looked up, turning back to the shattered oak door. It lay awkwardly on the floor, pathetic and broken. But Arthur's gaze did not linger on the wood fragments. It was drawn to a gleaming metal object lying near Elias's feet. It was the main door lock. It had been torn from the doorframe after Elias's powerful impact. Arthur squinted, shining the flashlight onto it. There was something odd, an unusual technical detail that a person knowledgeable about security like himself should have noticed immediately. He rose, staggering toward the lock. He bent down, picking it up. It felt heavy in his hand, cold as evidence of a transgression. Arthur turned the lock over in his hand, the cold metal sensation seeping through his skin. He narrowed his eyes, shining the flashlight onto the distorted lock core. This was a double-cylinder deadbolt lock. He recognized this type of lock. He had authorized the installation cost. At the time, Isabella had requested absolute security. She argued that the standard interior thumb-turn bolt was too easily fiddled with by children. She required something more robust. Arthur had agreed. He believed it was a mother's prudence, but now holding it, Arthur saw the true nature of that prudence. This type of lock had no interior thumb turn. It only had a keyhole on both sides. This meant that if someone locked the door from the outside and removed the key, the person inside would be completely trapped. There was no way to open it. Arthur felt the ground beneath him crumble. This door wasn't forced open for entry. It was forced open for liberation. He spun around to face Elias. The neighbor still stood there, leaning against the wall, his breathing less frantic, but his eyes still heavy with sorrow. "You," Arthur stammered, his voice choked in his throat. "You weren't trying to enter the house. You were trying to open the door." Elias gave a slight nod, a weary but resolute confirmation. "I heard the child." Elias said, his voice rough. He pointed toward the large reinforced glass window overlooking the front lawn. "Not crying. Your glass is too thick. I heard scratching." Arthur walked to the window. He shone the flashlight onto the glass surface. At the height of a 7-year-old child, there were faint, messy, desperate scratches, the marks of small fingernails that had attempted to claw at the indifferent glass for hours. Each scratch was like a silent cry for help. "The child has been there all afternoon," Elias continued, his voice devoid of accusation, only stating the painful truth. "I saw your wife drive away around 1 PM. She locked the door, activated the perimeter alarm system. I initially thought the child was with her, but then I noticed the tiny shadow at the window." Arthur closed his eyes. The image of Lily pressing her face against the glass, gazing out at the world in despair, was agonizingly clear in his mind. The child had seen Elias. The child had seen freedom right before her eyes, but couldn't reach it. And when Elias started to break the door, Lily panicked. She didn't understand. She had been conditioned by Isabella that the outside world was rife with danger, that strangers were a threat. She believed Elias was a menacing figure attempting to infiltrate her sanctuary, when in reality, he was the only person attempting to breach that prison. "Daddy, the neighbor's trying to break in." Lily's words over the phone now echoed in Arthur's head with a completely different meaning. It wasn't an accusation. It was the shriek of a prisoner who didn't recognize her rescuer. Arthur let the lock fall to the floor. Clunk. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed enormous checks to build this house, the hands that had hired the finest architects to design the soundproofing system, the most advanced security system. He had thought he was building a castle for his princess. It turned out he had constructed a sturdy prison for the warden, and that warden was Isabella. The times he called home and Lily didn't answer. She is sleeping. She is concentrating on her piano practice. She is being disciplined for not being good. All of Isabella's plausible explanations were now revealed as blatant falsehoods. She locked the child up whenever she wished to go out and enjoy her own life. She turned Arthur's absence into an opportunity to exercise her cruel control. "I am an accomplice," Arthur whispered, his voice shattering. "I gave her the key. I paid her to do this." He turned back to look at Lily. She still sat huddled in the corner, but her gaze was less terrified now that she saw her father was not attacking Elias. Arthur wanted to rush over and embrace her, to kneel and apologize, but he knew he was not yet worthy. Elias approached, placing a calloused hand on Arthur's shoulder, not for comfort, but for awakening. "Stop blaming yourself," Elias said quietly. Now is not the time. The child needs water, and she needs you to calm down before. He didn't finish his sentence before a dazzling beam of light swept across the living room window. Vroom, vroom, vroom. The smooth, familiar sound of a vehicle engine resonated from the gravel driveway outside. The headlights of a pristine white Mercedes passed over the fragments of the oak door, shining directly into the pitch-dark room. Arthur squinted against the sudden light. He recognized that engine sound. He had purchased it for Isabella last year on her birthday. The Queen had returned. The car door closed softly, the measured, elegant tapping of high heels on the stone steps. Isabella was entering, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the self-assurance of a woman who believed she was still in command of everything. She was completely unaware that the impeccable act she had staged had reached its conclusion, and the only audience left were those who would tear away her facade. Arthur straightened up. He wiped the tears from his face. Weakness vanished, replaced by a terrifying coldness, the coldness of a man who had just found the real target for his fury. Arthur stood straight, his arms hanging but his hands tightly clenched. The headlights from the Mercedes outside dimmed after the engine was turned off. The sound of high heels tapping on the stone steps was steady, dry. Each tap was like a countdown. The shattered oak door was no longer capable of concealing anything inside. Isabella stepped across the threshold, still holding her expensive silk umbrella. She stopped instantly upon seeing the rubble at her feet. The remaining polite smile on her face completely disappeared. She looked up, seeing Arthur standing there soaked with rain and filled with rage. Then she looked at Elias leaning against the wall and finally quickly glanced at Lily huddled in the corner. "Arthur, why are you here at this hour?" Isabella inquired, stepping into the house carefully, avoiding the wood fragments. "Look at that door. Do you know how much effort I put into having it commissioned?" She did not run to Lily. She did not ask why the child was sitting on the cold stone floor. She looked at Elias with clear contempt, her nose turned up as if detecting an unpleasant odor. "And why is this destructive madman in our living room? What are you doing? Call the law enforcement." Arthur took one step forward, completely blocking Isabella's view toward his daughter. His silence was so heavy that the air in the room seemed to thicken. He looked directly into his wife's eyes, the eyes he once found tender, now only two cold, stony depths. "What type of lock is that lying on the ground, Isabella?" Arthur asked, his voice low and vibrating. Isabella placed her umbrella on the plastic-covered table. She reached up to adjust a lock of hair that had not been disheveled by the storm wind. "It's a security lock. You know this area hasn't been secure lately. I only wanted to safeguard this residence." "Safeguard the residence or lock my daughter inside." Arthur stepped closer. "Why doesn't it have an interior thumb turn?" Isabella crossed her arms over her chest. She showed no signs of confusion. She looked at Arthur with the expression of someone enduring the unreasonableness of another. "Lily is too restless. She keeps attempting to sneak out when I am occupied. You are never at home. You don't realize how much difficulty a 7-year-old can create. I did it so the child would learn that every action has consequences." "The consequence of shattering a glass is being confined in the darkness all afternoon." Arthur pointed toward the main circuit breaker. "Why is the power off?" Isabella sighed a long, martyred sigh. Light and electronic devices distract her from self-reflection. Children require stillness to contemplate their missteps. You always indulge her excessively, which is why she never matures. Arthur looked down at his own hands, then at Lily's purple feet. The child still didn't speak a word, only stared at her father's suitum. She scratched the glass until her hands were bleeding. Isabella. She panicked so severely she contacted me in desperation. Do you realize what you are doing? That is because she lacks emotional self-control. You see, she requires much more instruction. You came home and destroyed all my diligent nurturing over the past months. Now look, the $20,000 door is reduced to kindling simply because of your irrational panic. Isabella moved closer to the grand piano, lightly tracing a finger across its surface and frowning at the dust. She made no attempt to look toward Lily, never once asking if the child was cold or hungry. In her eyes, the residence, the door, and the tidiness were far more important than the trembling life in the corner of the room. Arthur realized he had never truly known this woman. He had married an outward appearance. He had brought home a self-centered woman, one who viewed his daughter as a defective item needing repair according to her specifications, or worse, as a burden to be set aside so she could enjoy her social events unhindered. You don't care about her, Arthur stated, his voice chillingly calm. You don't even perceive her as a person. Isabella laughed, a shrill but dry sound. Care. You're occupied acquiring wealth in Manhattan all week, and I'm stuck here coping with this difficulty. I sacrificed my youth to manage this estate for you to ensure everything is consistently perfect when you return. Do you assume that perfection happens spontaneously? It requires discipline. It requires control. She approached Arthur, attempting to seek the usual sympathy. Come on, Arthur, don't overreact. We will contact a door repair technician tomorrow. Lily will go to bed and she will be a well-behaved child again in the morning. Everything will return to normal. Ciao. She reached out to touch his drenched arm, but Arthur pulled away. He turned his back to her, looking at Elias. The neighbor still stood there, witnessing the entire event with heavy eyes. Elias said nothing, but his gaze was a confirmation of everything Arthur had just understood. Arthur felt a peculiar shift of influence taking place within him. For many years, he had trusted those in suits, those who spoke eloquently and resided in luxurious estates. He had disdained people like Elias. But tonight, the person who saved his daughter's life was the one he looked down upon, and the one he trusted the most was the biggest source of danger. Elias, Arthur called, his voice resonating clearly in the dark room. Elias slightly raised his head. Please use your phone to call law enforcement. Inform them of a child abuse and unlawful confinement situation here. Isabella froze, her face instantly distorted. Her sophistication and elegance dissolved like a mist in the wind. She lunged forward, attempting to snatch the phone Elias had just taken from his coverall pocket. Are you insane, Arthur? Are you intending to destroy our status? Do you know what the press will write? Isabella shrieked, her voice becoming piercing, completely out of control. She was no longer the queen of the residence. She was like a cornered beast, revealing her predatory nature and ultimate self-absorption. Stop it, Isabella. It's over, Arthur stated, not looking at her even once. He knelt down beside Lily, this time not attempting to touch her immediately. He just sat there quiet, allowing the child to see that he wasn't leaving. Elias began speaking into the phone, his voice deep and clear. Isabella stood in the center of the room, breathing rapidly. She looked around the dark room at the white plastic covers like specters, and for the first time, she realized she was no longer the one directing the performance. She started to tremble, not from cold, but from the collapse of the false authority she had painstakingly constructed. The faint sound of a law enforcement vehicle siren wafted from the distance, piercing the storm's sound. Arthur knew this night would be very prolonged, but at least the darkness in this residence would be forced to retreat. He glanced at Lily and saw the child looking at him, a look filled with apprehension, but also containing a flicker of hope. However, when he looked at the damaged lock on the floor, Arthur suddenly noticed something he had overlooked until now, a detail that could completely alter his understanding of Isabella's actions in this residence over the past period. The rotating blue and red lights from the patrol vehicles swirled across the pristine white walls of the living room, creating a chaotic dance. Police officers stepped across the shattered threshold, their footwear treading on the plastic sheeting covering the furniture, producing dry, rustling sounds. A female officer knelt next to Lily, but the child's eyes remained fixed on Arthur. Isabella stood, confined, her hands cuffed behind her back. The impeccable makeup from the morning was now smeared from the rain and panic. She no longer possessed her usual distinguished appearance. She looked at Arthur, her eyes conveying resentment. "You will regret this, Arthur. I sacrificed my life to maintain this house on course. Do you truly believe a child will mature properly without firmness?" Arthur did not look at her. He stood still, his arms limp. Isabella was led away across the steps. The sound of her high heels stumbled over the shattered wood fragments, creating a broken rhythm. When the patrol vehicle door slammed shut, her screams about her honor and sacrifice completely vanished behind the soundproof glass. The front lawn of the Sterling residence still glistened with the lights of the law enforcement vehicles, but the atmosphere was beginning to shift. The rain had subsided, only the sound of water dripping from the eaves onto the trampled rose bushes remained. The last of the police officers departed after documenting the scene and obtaining a quick statement from Elias. The house became still, a genuine stillness. Arthur felt the coldness from the marble floor penetrating his soaking, wet clothes. He looked around the room. The plastic covers on the sofas resembled the mummies of a simulated life. He walked to the large refrigerator in the kitchen area where the paper listing the Sterling House regulations still rested. He yanked it down with his hand. The paper tore, leaving white fragments on the cold steel surface. He walked back to the living room corner where Lily still sat. Arthur no longer looked down at her from above. He slowly lowered his body, sitting on the floor, directly opposite his daughter. His suit worth thousands of dollars was now soiled with mud and rainwater draped across the wood fragments. He did not care. Arthur looked into Lily's eyes. For the first time, he recognized how much those eyes resembled her mother's, an untainted beauty carrying a profound sorrow. "Lily, look at me." The child slightly raised her head. Her small shoulders still trembled in gentle spasms. "I was wrong. I thought providing you with a beautiful house and financial means was sufficient. I thought the quietness in this residence was happiness." Arthur paused, his throat tight with emotion. He raised his trembling hand but drew it back, fearing the child would flinch away. "I left you with a person who did not cherish you. I was too preoccupied focusing on the figures to remember to look into your eyes. I am sorry, Lily. I truly am sorry." Lily looked at her father. New tears welled up, cleansing the dust streaks on her small face. "Are you going to confine me again?" The 7-year-old child's question felt like a deep cut to Arthur's heart. He shook his head, his tears falling onto the stone floor. "Never. There will be no more regulations. There will be no more locked doors. Tomorrow I will have all the wooden planks removed from the windows. I want you to see the sunlight stream in here. I want you to run and jump, to break things, to shout loudly if you wish." Arthur sat still, waiting. He knew forgiveness did not come as quickly as signing a contract. But then a wondrous thing happened. Lily slowly extended her small hand. Her thin fingers touched the wet, dirty fabric of Arthur's suit. She grasped the cloth as if clutching a final lifeline. He did not rush to embrace her. He allowed her to move closer on her own. Gradually, Lily crawled toward him and rested her head on Arthur's shoulder. The warmth from her small body spread, dispelling the coldness of the long-standing prison house. Arthur closed his eyes, holding his daughter with all the tenderness he possessed. He felt Lily's heartbeat steady and real. "I will be here. I am not leaving." From the main entrance, Elias still stood quietly. He had remained there throughout the law enforcement's process, like a protective sentinel who never took his eyes off the child. He picked up the iron bar from the floor, wiping the mud streaks from his hands on his worn coveralls. Arthur looked up at Elias. "Elias, I don't know what to express. Monetary compensation. I understand you don't require it, but I owe you this life." Elias looked at the father and daughter. A faint smile crossed his harsh face, softening the lines of weariness. "Don't discuss obligations, Sterling. I did it for the child. I heard her sounds every day. I made a commitment to myself that I wouldn't allow any child to cry in silence like that again. Elias turned, stepping out onto the porch. His steps were firm on the wet gravel. "Hey, Elias," Arthur called out. "You won't relocate, will you? I want my daughter to have a genuine neighbor, a good person." Elias paused but didn't turn around. He lightly swung the iron bar as a form of farewell. "I'll still be there, right next door. Just leave the door open if you want the child to hear the sounds of birdsong in my garden." Elias's form gradually faded into the garden's darkness, but the sense of his presence lingered, a symbol of quiet benevolence requiring no title or recognition. Arthur watched him, realizing that a millionaire like himself was far surpassed by the impoverished man in terms of spiritual richness. The values he had worshipped for so long, status, oversight, tidiness, were now merely ashes before the power of simple compassion. Outside, the storm had fully passed. The sound of howling wind had vanished, replaced by the chirping of crickets beginning to sound in the grass. Arthur lifted Lily. She was too light, so light that he felt anguish over his long-term lack of attentiveness. He stepped across the debris of the oak door. He did not close it. That door would never be closed again until a new door without a double-key lock was installed. Standing at the entrance, Arthur looked up at the sky. The dark clouds had dispersed, revealing the deep blue night sky of the Connecticut suburb. Stars began to emerge, twinkling like small embers of hope. "Look, Lily, the stars." Lily looked up, her eyes reflecting the light from the sky. For the first time in many years, she took a deep breath of the outside world's air, the smell of damp earth, wild grass, and the scent of liberation. "They are so beautiful, Daddy." Arthur hugged his daughter tighter. He stepped down the stairs, treading on the soaked grass. He realized he didn't need to return to Manhattan tonight or any other night if it meant sacrificing his time with Lily. The ivory tower had crumbled, and from the fragments, a true father was born. The Sterling mansion still stood large and magnificent under the starlight, but now it was no longer an isolated fortress. The door was flung open, welcoming the night breeze, a confirmation that the darkness had passed. A new beginning was commencing, not with financial contracts, but with a small hand in his and the promise of a future filled with light. Sunrise was approaching, and this time it would bring genuine warmth to this residence. 3 months after that frightening night, the Connecticut suburb welcomed the golden, honeyed sunbeams of autumn. The maple trees around the Sterling estate began to turn a brilliant red, their leaves falling onto the lawn, which was once meticulously trimmed, but now dotted with patches of dry leaves and a few forgotten plastic playthings. Arthur Sterling sat on the stone steps where the neighbor Elias had once thrown his entire body against the confinement. He was no longer wearing his expensive Italian suit or silk tie. Instead, he wore a thin sweater and simple jeans. Arthur held a hot cup of coffee, the steam blurring his eyes, which had previously only focused on the stock market screen. He looked toward the main entrance. The old carved oak door had been replaced with a new one, made of light-colored maple, featuring large glass panels to welcome the sunlight. Most importantly, its lock was the simplest type he could find. One Lily could effortlessly open from the inside with a gentle turn of the knob. Lily's clear laughter from the backyard interrupted Arthur's thoughts. It was a sound he would have considered chaos 6 months ago, but now it was the beat of life. "Lily, don't run too quickly. You'll bump into Mr. Elias's flower bed," Arthur called out loudly, his voice carrying a relaxation he had never experienced in his life. He set down his coffee cup, stood up, and walked toward the wooden fence. The fence separating the two residences, once a symbol of the divide between affluence and poverty, had been partially taken down, creating a small gravel path. Elias was crouched beside the marigold bed, his calloused hands instructing Lily on how to prune the wilted stems. The neighbor looked the same, reserved in his clothes dusted with soil and sand, but his eyes no longer held the deep, sorrowful look of that night. "Mr. Elias says flowers also need to breathe. Daddy." Lily looked up, her face flushed from the sunlight. Lily's eyes now truly smiled. The fear of being confined in the darkness had gradually retreated, replaced by curiosity and trust. Arthur looked at his daughter, then at Elias. He still felt a jolt run down his spine, remembering he had nearly assaulted this man. "Thank you, Elias. She only wants to be in the garden these days." Elias stood up, dusting the dirt from his knees. He looked at Arthur with discreet respect. There wasn't much effusive language between the two men. Since that night they had short conversations by the fence, where Arthur learned that Elias was a retired firefighter due to an injury, and he had lost his only daughter in an accident years ago. That was why he always watched Lily, because he sensed her unusual silence through the cold stone walls. "Children are like seedlings, Sterling," Elias said, his voice rough but warm. "They need sunlight and to touch the earth. Don't keep them in a glass cage for too long." Arthur nodded, realizing he had learned more from this neighbor than from all the powerful financial advisors in Manhattan. He now closed his city office earlier each day, delegating operational authority to his subordinates to be home in time for dinner. He learned to prepare grilled sandwiches, even though his first attempt completely burned the kitchen, which had previously been as spotless as a laboratory. But when Lily giggled and called it delicious, Arthur understood that the perfection Isabella had constructed was a dangerous concoction. Isabella was awaiting her final court appearance. Investigations by law enforcement and psychological experts had peeled back her facade layer by layer. They discovered chilling diary entries where she meticulously documented taming the child as a social experiment. Isabella showed no remorse. She still believed she was a misunderstood educator. Arthur had entirely removed the woman's presence from the residence. The plastic covers on the sofas were thrown into the trash, the expensive lily-scented perfumes replaced with the pleasant aroma of baked goods and citrus essential oils. Arthur turned back toward the entrance as he saw the private therapist's vehicle pull up. This was part of the healing process. Once a week, Lily would talk to dismantle the final psychological barriers her stepmother had instilled. "Time to get ready, Lily. Ms. Sarah is here," Arthur said gently. Lily nodded, waved to Elias, and happily ran toward the door. She opened the door with one hand, no key needed, no permission required from anyone. The door swung wide, welcoming the autumn breeze into the hallway, which had once been thick with the smell of mildew. Arthur invited the therapist inside, but before stepping across the threshold, he stopped to look at Elias. "I'm planning to grill dinner outdoors tonight. Will you join us? Lily mentioned you particularly enjoy grilled corn." Elias showed a moment of surprise, Then he smiled, a genuine smile that eased the harsh lines on his face. "Absolutely, Sterling. I'll bring a few bottles of beer." Arthur entered the house. The living room was now filled with light. The marble floor was no longer mirror-like. Instead, there were crayon streaks Lily had made that morning. He sat on the sofa, the seat now softer without the dry plastic layer. He observed Lily chatting with Ms. Sarah. The child had started to express her emotions. She talked about how afraid she used to be of the sound of the key, fearing that when the click sound resonated, her world would shrink into four walls. Arthur sat there listening to every word from his daughter, his heart aching, but also filled with hope. He realized that emotional abuse leaves no physical marks, but it corrodes the spirit from within. And the healing process began with listening. "Daddy, can I invite my friend Ben from school over on Saturday?" Lily abruptly turned to ask, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Of course, Lily. You can invite anyone you wish. Our house is always open." Lily smiled, the most spontaneous smile Arthur had ever witnessed. Late in the afternoon, after Ms. Sarah departed, Arthur walked through the house. He threw open all the windows on the second floor. He looked down into the garden, seeing Elias clearing dry leaves. Arthur realized that a man's worth is not measured by the height of the tower he stands on, but by how low he can bend to lift a small hand. He remembered that stormy night, the call, "The neighbor is trying to break in." He had initially thought it was a curse, but now he understood it was a miracle. Elias had not tried to enter the house to transgress. He had entered to save a family that was withering away in luxury. Arthur walked to the display cabinet where he once showcased expensive artifacts. He took out a new photo frame. It was a picture he had taken with his phone the previous week, Lily covered in dirt, grinning widely next to Elias and a pile of wild grass. There was no formality, no dark suits or velvet dresses, only genuine humanity and affection. He placed the photograph on his desk. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, shining on the glass of the photo frame, twinkling like stars. The outdoor dinner took place in a warm atmosphere. The savory smell of grilled meat blended with the scent of dry grass. Elias shared stories from his firefighting days about times he rescued cats stranded in trees. Lily listened attentively, occasionally exclaiming with delight. Arthur felt like a traveler who had finally found an oasis after years wandering in the desert of solitude. When Elias departed, Arthur led Lily inside. He did not lock the main door with the double key bolt anymore. He only lightly engaged the standard safety latch. "Daddy," Lily said as she lay in bed, the warm blanket covering her chest. "I am no longer afraid of the dark." Arthur kissed his daughter's forehead, inhaling the delicate scent of children's shampoo. "Because I am always here, and your window always has the moonlight, Lily." He stepped out of her room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Walking down the stairs, Arthur paused in the main hallway for a long moment. He looked at the empty space where the old door had been. He realized that in life, we constantly try to construct solid doors to protect what we cherish, but sometimes we unintentionally lock ourselves inside with our fears. The Sterling house door was no longer a separating boundary. It was a passage for understanding and kindness to enter. Arthur Sterling, the millionaire who once believed he controlled the whole world, finally understood that the real world resided in the small hand gripping his each morning and in the quiet compassion of the neighbor he had once scorned. The Connecticut night sky was calm and filled with stars. The autumn wind blew gently, carrying the promise of a winter that would no longer be cold, because in this house the flame of affection had truly been ignited, and the doors would always be open to welcome the light of dawn. The story is a powerful warning about detachment in the modern family. Never let preconceptions and glamorous appearances deceive you. Sometimes the most terrifying confinement is constructed with wealth and oversight in the name of love, and the true angels often appear in the unrefined form we least anticipate. Note: the preceding narrative is entirely fictitious. Character names, locations, and events were created to illustrate educational and artistic themes. Any resemblance to actual people or real-life events is purely coincidental.